So I'm sure many of you guys have been there. You pay $60+ for a new game, you take it home, or nowadays it's more likely you finish downloading it. And then after you install it, you're forced to download a giant day one patch that's supposed to polish the already completed game. So then after you get everything downloaded, you load it up, you sit on the couch, and then you get ready to. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about why patient gamers almost always win. And by winning, I'm talking about getting the best bang for your buck, your time, and just overall experience. And when I mean patient, I'm talking the dude that waits a year minimum, often 2 to 3 before picking up a game or console to play. Before I begin, just a couple of caveats I want to get out the way. Going to be pretty critical of developers, but indie devs, they generally get a pass since their teams tend to be kind of small and the funding tends to be limited. And they're already typically pretty heavily discounted as far as price goes. And then there's some quality consumer-focused devs out there. CDPR is one that comes to mind. If there's a particular developer that you want to support to ensure future titles will drop, go for it. I mean, who am I to tell you what to do with your money? This is rather just a PSA for those that have the mindset that we need to buy into the hype and get things day one. My goal is for you to stop considering a day one purchase as something an early adopter would do and start thinking of it more as like what a beta tester would do. But this is a beta tester position that you're personally paying for. I'll also have some recommendations as what we as consumers can do. All these topics are related and they're a little bit tough to separate on points, but I will do my best. First point of value would be the initial price point. It's the simplest to get out the way. The standard price of a brand new AAA title is $60 plus tax, soon to be $70 if you're following all the next gen trends. That's a topic for another video. This is of course the base price and doesn't include pre-order bonuses and the other nonsense that tends to drive up the price. Don't worry, I have a whole section I'll get to about that later. So if you were to ignore the rest of the video, just know that games seem to have a depreciation similar to brand new cars, for which those of you that don't know tend to lose close to 10 to 15% within the first month of owning that car. The same goes for games, which often lose 10 to 15% of their value right after purchasing the game itself. You don't believe me? Try buying a game from GameStop and then just selling it back to them the next day. Or better yet, you can often find games on eBay or Craigslist or OfferUp or any of those other marketplaces you have in your area for a game that came out 2 to 3 months ago. Same thing goes for consoles, though you might have to be a bit more patient. The savings will often take longer to realize, usually 6 months to 2 years depending on what console we're talking about. And then Nintendo and the Switch, they usually don't follow these patterns, unfortunately, but that's a topic for another day. Not really a fan of how Nintendo games don't drop in price. So switching over to the next topic, let's just say that the first point is moot for you because the money isn't really that big of a deal. Because maybe for you, the money isn't too much of an issue, or playing video games may be your only type of vice, hobby, pastime, and the money isn't as limiting a factor for you as the time is. So then that would bring me to my second point, the quality assurance and bugs. And when I mean bugs, I'm not talking the funny kind that will make you laugh sometimes when you're playing. I'm talking about the game-breaking bugs that destroy the immersion of the experience. Now, it's understandable that a game will have bugs, especially one that has a large, encompassing world with dozens, if not hundreds of NPCs. But there's games out there like Mountain Blade Viking Conquest, Mass Effect Andromeda, Final Fantasy XIV, and Assassin's Creed Unity had pretty egregious launches, and there's a bunch others. Those are just the ones that came to mind for me. In fact, Final Fantasy XIV, I'm a big fan of Final Fantasy franchise, I was at least, had to be completely revamped, and the game had to be re-released as A Realm Reborn. And even Viking Conquest, I'm a big fan of the Mountain Blade franchise, was repackaged and re-released as Viking Conquest Reforged. These are games that I was pretty familiar with, but there's probably hundreds of other examples. If you have any more that stand out, just shout them out in the comments below. In terms of consoles, there are the terrible failures. Man, I still have nightmares of the Red Ring of Death, especially back in the day when $300 was a big deal. My PS3 died on me before, and there were issues with the Wii U and even the Joy-Cons of the Switch. Regardless if the company replaces or repairs the consoles through some sort of warranty, it's still a hassle and headache that's typically avoided if the customer waits. Remember, for the Red Ring of Death, I had to pay for shipping for there and back. I think it was like $30 or $40. So, I mean, that was still a big deal and something that I really don't want to deal with in the future. Then there's the elephant in the room for video games: microtransactions. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to bunch DLC, the microtransactions, missing content, expansions, whatever you want to call them, all in the same category. Though, there's some exceptions where DLC isn't just a cash grab and it may have some legitimate value and justify its additional cost. But typically, I'm just going to bunch them all together for the purposes of this discussion. A lot of this bullshit, in my opinion, started with MMORPGs and PC games that had expansion packs. This became such a lucrative opportunity that it started the whole bullshit games as a service movement. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong with MMORPGs. It's just that many of those practices taken from the MMORPGs, developers of single-player games started transposing them to games that simply don't warrant it. A perfect example of this is the Lord of the Rings game, The Shadow of War. Excellent game, by the way, in its current state. When the game was first released, it had systems in place to monetize game mechanics. This is a single-player game, mind you. It has some multiplayer component to it, but it's mainly a single-player game, but it resembled a mobile gacha game. I'm talking loot crates, mana, pay-to-win mechanics. If you guys aren't familiar with these things, you guys can look them up. I really don't want to get into detail about them, but suffice it to say, these things have no place in a full-priced AAA title. Now, there's other channels that cover this game in far more depth, but all I want to say is that it was bullshit, complete bullshit. And the developer even admitted to it. About 7 months after releasing the game, the player base shrank up and they milked most of the fans dry. They ended up getting rid of these pretty bad practices. Sleeping Dogs, another great game in my opinion, is basically like a GTA game, but you play a cop, had ridiculous DLC practices when it first released. Around 25 DLC with a combined retail price of $95. That's not including the game. Came out post-release. Now the complete edition can be found with all the DLC unlocked for less than $5, and it's a complete package including the game. Final Fantasy 15 is another game that came to mind. As I said before, I was a huge fan of Final Fantasy franchise, and 15 was a game that I was extremely hyped about. After waiting over 8 or 9 years for the game to come out, the game at launch was such a horrid experience. The narrative and story was an absolute mess. They actually had plans to patch up the game quite a bit and added more DLC to it. And I heard that it was relatively serviceable, though it's still pretty mediocre compared to the other entries in the series. But I digress. Final Fantasy 15 is a game I can make a future video about. Then there's the Sims 4 bullshit. There's a laundry list of expansion packs that have constantly been added to years after release. So just for shits and giggles, I calculated the cost of everything the game has to offer. The game has to offer. And the full retail cost of everything is $600. $600 for a sequel to a sequel to a sequel. I mean, it's one thing to enjoy a game, but to pay the price of an entire PC or game console for one game over the course of years is insane. At least it is to me. Even a game that I thoroughly enjoyed, Crusader Kings 2, was notorious for this. A game that released in 2012 had over 60 pieces of DLC with a combined retail price of $300, not including the price of the game, which is free to play right now, by the way, which I encourage you to try out. Many of these games that I mentioned before can now be picked up with all the bullshit DLC in the form of a Game of the Year edition or like a gold bundle or ultimate edition at a significant discount, often coming much cheaper than the base game at launch. So you often can get the complete product with everything the developer has to offer at a much cheaper price if you were to just wait. But this list that I mentioned is definitely not all-encompassing. And there's other dumpster fires like Anthem, Mass Effect Andromeda, Fallout 76, among many others. If there's any glaring examples I left out, just please shout them out. The same thing tends to go for consoles and hardware. Around midway through a console's lifespan, the console gets some sort of upgrade. Maybe it's just like a slimmer design or other cosmetic change that often improves how noisy the console is, or if it heats up, it kind of alleviates those problems. But this last generation, we actually saw newer versions of consoles that had upgraded specs and sometimes features like the Xbox One S and the Xbox X and the PlayStation 4 Pro, and they both had faster specs in general. And then there was the Nintendo Switch V2, which had a better battery life. And after wrapping all this together, it brings me back to my final point, which is to me the most important point: the complete experience. Now, way back before I had any hair on my chest, a long time ago, you'd buy a game and you'd beat it. And then you'd play the game all over again. And you'd repeat that until you got sick of the game. That was just the way things were. But games back then had tons of replayability. And more importantly, they were complete experiences, completely standalone. But nowadays, the experience is different. You buy a half-finished game for full price. You start experiencing a ton of those nasty bugs. You try to finish the game, and then if you get that far, most people don't even finish the game. But let's say you finish the game, and then you get that strange feeling that, maybe there should have been more to it, or maybe it should have been more polished. Then months, maybe even years later, you find out that the devs have brought out patches and DLC that have fixed a lot of the issues that you had with the game. And there might even be more content in it. How many of you will go back and enthusiastically play that game? How many of you are willing to fork over even more cash to play the game? Maybe get the full experience? I know a lot of you are strapped for time, and maybe the money's not the big deal. So how many of you want to go back and play a game you've already played? I know I don't. For consoles, the parallel point would be the game libraries themselves. I remember buying a PlayStation 3 at launch and not buying a single game for more than 6 months. And to me, it's really a waste of money to buy a brand new console, which is probably faulty from a manufacturing standpoint on launch day, and then have to wait 6 months or even a year to buy any games that was worth buying the console for. To go back to the analogy of buying a car, it would be like a person buying a brand new car for top dollar, but it's actually the base model that's missing all the cool features the upper tier ones tend to have, like better sound systems, a nicer interior, body kits, safety features, and on top of that, it also has 200,000 miles on it, so it isn't as reliable. However, if you wait to buy that same model car, things will change. Let's say you wait a year. Not only will the price drop, but features will get added on. Car will get more reliable, it'll probably drive nicer, like miles were taken off the odometer. This is the example I see with buying a launch title. You buy it at the highest price, with the least amount of content, and in the most unreliable state. Another example I can mention is potentially like you go and watch a movie at the theaters. So you watch this movie and you know that there's issues with the movie. Maybe it had problems in production. And after you watch it, you know that it could have been so much better. And then years after the fact, maybe the director comes out and says that we're going to remake the movie and make it much better. Even though you've already seen it first time and paid a ticket, we're going to charge you to watch the same movie again. I mean, who would think that something like that would work? So all that being said, I hope that I put up a case why it is almost always better to wait when buying software or hardware when it comes to video games. Now, I know there's some people that object to my points outright because they think they're supporting the developers by buying the games at launch. And while I would agree with these people in a very few rare cases, most of the time I'd say it's bullshit, especially for AAA devs. I'm sure many of these companies don't look at their most loyal fans as early adopters. They're rather looking at these people as idiotic beta testers for paying top dollar for a product that isn't even finished. And then there's FOMO, or the fear of missing out. It really is difficult to try to ignore that, especially if you follow video game news on YouTube or other websites. I understand there's a certain excitement with buying a product on launch day and getting into it before YouTube and potentially all your friends already have it, and they may ruin some of those moments and hype for it. So then what's the point of waiting? Well, aside from getting a better experience for yourself, there's also like a meta game to it. So these companies, they don't really care about you. It's plain and simple. What they do care about, though, is separating you from your money. The more you reward these companies with your hard-earned money for ass quality games, the more ass quality games they'll produce. As long as we keep simping, they'll keep pimping. Simple. But perhaps it can be flipped on them. Perhaps if a bunch of people stop buying these half-ass games at launch and we don't purchase loot crates and the tons of bullshit DLC, and then maybe, just maybe, companies will get back to the days of releasing finished products. They'll care more about the customer's overall enjoyment, and perhaps they may even reward the early adopter or the loyal fan rather than trying to milk them dry. So that brings me to my last section, my recommendations or call to action, if you will, on how to easily go about this. First thing, I'd probably do a media blackout regarding games you may be excited about a few months before and after launch. I know it's probably a tough thing to do. I'm guilty of watching YouTubers gush about games I'm excited about, and it's hard to contain the hype. But if you have managed to avoid the game at launch and even past its hype period, then now you can check out the awesome discount market. It's a bit easier on PC, but it's possible for consoles as well. First thing I want to talk about is a site called istthereanydeal.com. I'll have a link below. I don't get paid by them or anything like that, but it does show various stores that have the game for sale. It even has historic prices to let you know if you're actually getting the best deal possible. There's the primary stores like the PlayStation Store or Steam, which often have good deals too depending on the sales. But I found key resellers like Green Man Gaming or Games Planet that can give you the game keys to put into whatever platform you're using to have the best deals. I've bought games from Green Man Gaming, some like $3 to $4 depending on the sale. Then there's more shady sites like G2A, which I have used before, but I wouldn't recommend them as the keys may have been gotten through nefarious means. I know someone personally that had an issue with the game key bought from that store. So I'd recommend just generally sticking to the legit sources. And if you prefer physical games, there's always OfferUp, eBay, and other local marketplaces. And if I failed to mention anything else, any other sources, please shout them out. And lastly, of course, there's going to be the games or hardware that you just have to buy on day one. Maybe you really do dig the company making it and you want to support them. Or maybe you just can't continue hype and you think the dev can deliver on day one, which I admit is kind of how I feel towards Cyberpunk. So you're willing to fork over the money on day one. But when I personally buy a game at launch day, I know I'm paying a premium for a subpar experience compared to just waiting. But personally, I just look at it like I'm paying a stupidity/impatience tax and move on. That way, since I look at it like a tax, I rarely buy games on day one. So just to summarize, you save money, get a higher quality product, and you get it at a complete package with more content. And that is why I think patient gamers win. But again, guys, you guys feel free to spend your money how you will. Just wanted to give you some things to think about when buying these games and supporting these developers and their practices. Thanks for watching until the end. Let me know if you agree, disagree in the comments below, like or dislike, and all that other stuff. Peace.